Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Big Basin Post-Fire Research Symposium. We are so happy to have you all join us for tonight's event. Tonight is hosted by the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council, and I am Jen Michelsen, the board president. The Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council is a small council whose mission is to encourage the conservation of biodiversity throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains bioregion, primarily through research, education, and the dissemination of accurate scientific information. Many of our directors have ongoing research projects in the fire zone or are scientists with roles in planning and recovery efforts related to the CZU fire. We invite you all to visit our website. It's at SCMBC.com to learn more about us. The 2020 CZU Lightning Complex Fire had an unprecedented catastrophic impact on ecosystems in the Big Basin State Park and adjacent areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains bioregion. Recovery will be slow and difficult, and it will require the use of the best available science. And that is why the Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council is promoting these and other research findings to aid in that effort. Next, I will introduce our moderators. First, we have Zane Moore. He's the leading expert in redwood genetics and is working with on the Redwood Genome Project at UC Davis. And also we have Will Russell, a professor at San Jose State. His research focuses on the anthropogenic natural ecological disturbances in forest ecosystems in California, and his research has increasingly been focused on coast redwood forests. Both of our moderators tonight are currently conducting research in the CZU burn area. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Zane, who will introduce our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming to this event and taking time out of your busy schedules to do so. And we thank the speakers up front for their willingness to speak with us tonight. How tonight is going to work is we are all going to be listening to 10-minute talks with 5 minutes left over after each talk for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to write that in the chat. We'll be monitoring questions. We predict that there will be a lot of them, so we may not be able to get to your questions. We want to get out of here by 8 p.m. And so we're going to be keeping to a strict 15-minute schedule. And I'll be monitoring the chat with questions. So please, again, put them in there. If you need to, if it's easier for you to say your question, we may unmute you if that needs to happen. So without any further ado, we are going to start off tonight with Skye Biblin. He's a graduate student at San Jose State University, and he is going to talk to us about prescribed fire and fuel loads in Big Basin.
All right, thank you, Zane. And I think I have screen share, is that right?
Yes, you should be able
to.
Okay,
cool. Let me start then. All right. So let's see, is that coming up for everyone? Sure, we got that right.
Yes, it looks awesome. Fine. Thank you.
Sure thing. All right. So yeah, thank you, Zane, for the introduction. My name is Skye Biblin. I'm coming from San Jose State University as a graduate researcher. My project is on the influence of prescribed burning on forest resistance, resilience, and wildfire risk. So a little bit about the just history of fire in Big Basin, of prescribed fire that is in Big Basin. There's a history of using prescribed fire as a land management tool by state parks in Big Basin since 1978. Prescribed fire in the sites that I sampled was applied to each site only once, with plots burned either 9, 14, or 22 years before the CZU fire. And these were all burns done in similar conditions, and they're all low intensity understory burns. So, really the objective here is to ascertain whether these prescribed fires achieved their goals now in the aftermath of the CZU Lightning Complex fires. I've went ahead and highlighted in green the factors where prescribed fire was found to have a significant influence. So going through those, there's research question 1 was whether prescribed fires improve stand resistance to wildfire. So this is really how they stood up to the fire, how the trees stood up to the fire. The second question was whether there was an improvement to stand resilience to wildfire. So how these trees and plants bounce back. And the last question is whether prescribed burning decreases the risk of repeated wildfire. So I'll leave this up for just a second so you can see sort of the different metrics I was measuring. And I'm going to be focusing on the highlighted ones because those are the ones that are seeming at this state of my research to be the most promising with results. For my research methods, all this data was collected in either summer or fall of 2021. And all of the sites, so were burned in the CZU fire. So there was 120-meter diameter plots across 6 sites, 3 of those sites with prescribed fire history and 3 controls without a history of prescribed fire. I counted all trees that had at least 50% of their basal area within the plot and ran 200 transect lines for sampling ground fuels. As for the data calculations, these were done for fuels using Brown's 1974 Handbook for Inventorying Downwoody Materials. Also utilized just some descriptive statistics to look at correlations between all of the different measurements taken and prescribed fire, and then ultimately put everything through a generalized linear mixed effect model using our programming software. And at this point in my research, I've completed most of the data analysis, but this is all at the stage where it's still needs some review and it's still, I would say, preliminary, but there's some interesting trends that I'm excited to share today. So jumping into them, the first one I have here is bole char height for redwoods. So just to give a little definition of what I'm talking about bole char height, that's how high up the burn was on the tree. So the tree that's up in front here, you can see that would be a 100% bole char height because the entirety of height of the tree burned, whereas the redwood in the back, maybe that might be more like a 30% bole char height because it's the percent of the total height. And what we see in the results here is that there was a decrease in the lower bole char height percent in areas with prescribed fire. So this can be seen as a proxy for fire severity and shows that there was some influence from these prescribed fires as far as limiting the intensity of the burn, at least for coast redwoods. The next thing that came out as significant with a relationship with prescribed fire is canopy cover. So canopy cover was measured using a spherical densiometer taken at the plot center of each of the plots. 4 readings were taken at each plot. And this first measurement here is just how much light was hitting the ground. And so here you see that there's more canopy cover in the areas with prescribed fire, not a drastically big difference, but enough that could make a big difference. And this is very important as understory plants are starting to recover. And this can be an indicator that we actually have maybe a quicker recovery in these areas with prescribed fire back to the types of understory species that we associate with the understory of the coast redwood forest. And a little bit different than just canopy cover, this is a measure of retained canopy. And this is done with just ocular estimation, looking at the crown and trying to figure out what is new growth since the fire and what was from before. And that's just done on the shade of green, really. So this shown that there was a lot more retained canopy in those areas with prescribed fire. And this is, I think, a very a useful, interesting result in that it can show maybe how the fire behaved differently between the areas with and without prescribed fire. Thinking about that, there's higher canopy retention, crown retention. So there could have been, more crown fire in those areas without prescribed fire. So then getting into percent new growth. So this is sort of just inverse of the last slide, but looking at how much new growth has occurred in the canopy since the fire, since this 2020 fire. And you actually see that there's less growth in the prescribed fire sites. And that's actually to be expected because, as with redwoods, when there's a higher severity fire, there'll be more prolific sprouting after that. So it actually makes sense that we would see more growth in the areas that burned more severely, which aligns up with the other numbers that we've seen so far. So another, back to, this was my research question 3 about the risk of repeated wildfire. I think there's this idea that because we just had a wildfire, that we're sort of in the clear, and this, we know now really isn't the case. And so we're already thinking about what to expect next. And so what we saw here is that after the wildfire, there is a difference, a significant difference in the amount of coarse woody fuels. And these are fuels that are larger in size. So they were categorized as coarse woody fuels or fine woody fuels, fine being small, flashy, quick burning fuels, whereas coarse woody fuels are larger, would take longer to burn. We didn't see a correlation with fine woody fuels. However, with coarse woody fuels, there was a significant decrease in areas with prescribed fire, which could lend us to expect that there might be a lower risk of another wildfire in those areas that were previously treated with prescribed fire. So next, looking at prescribed fire's influence on how many trees were top killed. So while prescribed fire wasn't shown to have a big influence on tree mortality, there was this big difference in top killed trees. And you can see here the difference at top killed trees, anything that doesn't have any live crown. So no green on it other than from the base. So you can see on this madrone, it's got basal sprouts, but it's top killed. So we see here that there's about twice as many top killed trees in those areas with an absence of prescribed fire. So this could be seen in a number of ways. It could be seen as a metric of resistance, also resilience, that there's more living trees now, and then also looking at our risk of future wildfires would be lower. We think about these top kill trees being aerial fuels that are dried out and pose a large risk to future wildfires. Next, looking at percent of trees with live crown. So this is a little bit of an indicator of these different stand dynamics. Looking at where there's prescribed fire, we have a higher percentage of the trees that are still there have live crown, a much higher percentage. So once again, a little bit lower severity fire, we would think, and trees that have green on them are going to be healthier and likely not dry and don't pose as much of a fire risk. And then another key finding was this tree density, that this one includes both saplings and trees, but that in prescribed fire sites, we actually had a lot fewer trees, which is more of the old growth characteristics we are looking for in our coast redwood forest, and also has more spacing between trees, which is better situated for resistance to future wildfires. And similar to the last slide, this is just one that includes or is just trees, which means anything with a diameter at breast height of at least 10 centimeters, the same trend as before, but more trees in places without prescribed fire, less with prescribed fire. And then what's really important is when you put those things together, I think, with this last metric here, which is the average tree diameter, that the trees are significantly larger that are still standing in Big Basin where there was a history of prescribed fire. So you put that picture together, what you have is fewer trees that are larger in diameter in those areas that have been treated with prescribed fire. So we can see this as a much more resistant, resilient landscape to future wildfire, and also aligning with a lot of the goals of those prescribed fires of sort of bringing back an old growth or late cereal stage stand structure. So yeah, that brings it to the end. And I just wanted to thank all the people who have helped out in this research process, whether that's out in the field or helping with my calculations. It's been a big process. So I'm happy to share any slides, any of my raw data, or anything with anyone. So feel free to grab this email and send me an email, and I'll be defending my thesis with final results sometime in spring of 2023 that I hope to share with everyone. And if anyone has any questions now.
Thank you, Sky. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. One of the questions that I have is about how prescribed fire, like basically now after this, we have seen the CZU fire. What do you think we should be doing with regards to prescribed fire in the future? Should we be using it more frequently or less frequently? What do you think your data might support?
Yeah, I mean, I think that while the results aren't super strong, we're looking at fires that were low intensity fires that were all at least 9 years ago. So I think that that's really is still a pretty strong correlation with a lot of these factors. And what I would say is that I think it's like now is the time that we need to be thinking about putting fire onto the land and not sort of waiting till these fields build up. So in that sort of debate of whether we're at a higher or lower risk now to a future wildfire, I think it's the time to be putting prescribed fires on the ground where there might be a little lower risk of those prescribed fires escaping while we have lower fuels and kind of getting ahead for change, I guess.
We have a question from Tom asking any difference on how Doug fir, madrone, et cetera, handled fire versus redwood?
So at large, extreme differences. I focused my results on whether prescribed fire had a difference, and there wasn't one. Of course, redwoods are going to be the most resistant, resilient. Tan oaks are not resistant but resilient. Madrone's the same, and Doug fir struggled. I know that that's been a big concern for a lot of people in our community that care about Big Basin, is sort of how can we protect, like particularly Doug firs that are sensitive to wildfire. I didn't see any convincing results that the prescribed fire helped these trees. And I think one of the reasons there is that even if it reduced severity, if you reduce severity from 100 feet down to 80 feet, that's still going to kill that Douglas fir.
Do you think, so Claire Lacey has a comment in here saying that if anyone wants to get involved with a local prescribed fire, they can check out the Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association, calpba.org. I'm not sure if they work in Big Basin itself, but yeah, that would be something to check out. Another question of mine. So when you have, I guess the pluses and minuses is basically forest density or not, fuel density or not. When you have crown cover, it shades the forest floor. Do you think that would keep the fuels drier at all to reduce fire risk? Or, where's the balancing point between too much canopy cover or not enough in terms of prescribed burns and how much we burn the forest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I don't have a clear answer, and I think it's really dependent on the landscape. I guess one thing I definitely have wanted to make clear, like with this project, is I think it speaks to the effectiveness and efficacy of prescribed fire in this specific landscape, maybe southern coast redwoods, but that's going to be very different for different areas. And so, but I do think you got on something. It's like there's like kind of like Goldilocks effect, right? Of like we want to be reducing the stand density, but not allowing the fuels to dry out too much. I think, in this case, when we're talking about places like Big Basin, we're kind of at like, even though we have this history of prescribed fire, it's pretty low scale. And so I don't think, my personal opinion is like, we haven't gotten quite to that tipping point where those prescribed fires might be doing more harm than good as far as wildfire mitigation. But I think it's something to keep in mind as not to just blindly put fire on the land.
Yeah, gotcha. We have one more question from one of our speakers who's yet to come. I'm going to ask Carolyn to unmute herself and ask her question.
Yeah, thanks, Zane. This is super interesting. Thanks for sharing, Sky. I would guess I was just curious if there were any of the factors that you measured that weren't significantly different between the plots that had prescribed fire history and those that did, and whether you think that any of those things are sort of interest to you.
Yeah, totally. And I kind of expected that there'd be a few people in the audience who want to see that kind of stuff. And so I'd be like happy to share all my slides that has, this is kind of the boiled down, like I think I shared maybe 9 things that there was a significant relationship. There's probably another 25 that didn't have a relationship. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth looking into further. And it also doesn't mean they don't end up, being utilized even in this paper or another paper, because maybe the absence of an effect is still important. So, big ones I would say is that there wasn't really any difference in mortality between these trees. And other than coarse woody fuels, there wasn't a difference, for like fine woody fuels. Things like duff, litter didn't matter because they all got wiped out anyway. So I'd be happy to share all of the things that sort of didn't stick with the statistics so far. And please feel free to send me an email and I can share those.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Sky. I want to remind everyone we will have this recording on YouTube in perpetuity after these talks. So if you'd like to go back and revisit any of this, you can see those slides on YouTube. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Mojgan Mahdizadeh, and they are another graduate student at San Jose State University, working with Will Russell, and they'll be telling us about, give me 1 second. They'll be telling us about tree survival post-fire. So more of these questions about the trees in Big Basin.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So my name is Mojgan, and I'm a graduate student from San Jose State, and I'll be presenting our research about the early post-response of redwood forest at Big Basin following the CZU fire. A little bit of history of fire in our area. Fire is a major disturbance in the redwood community that dictates species distribution, stand composition, and ecological succession. And recent studies indicate that human-caused climate change has increased the risk of forest fire in Mediterranean climate system. In California, we are experiencing extensive tree mortalities and record-breaking fires in recent years that can lead to shift in forest composition and structure. Up until the 19th century, surface fire was frequent occurrence by Native Americans in California in grasslands and oak woodlands, with decreasing frequency in chaparral and mixed evergreens. And the least frequent ignition was in coastal coniferous forest. The burning continued into the early European settlement period as a result of grazing and post-logging /burning. In this period, fire frequency and intensity increased, and often fire escaped into the unlogged areas. And then fire suppression policy went into the effect in the early 20th century, which radically changed the fire regime and led to a decrease in fire frequency and accumulation of fuel load. The history of natural fire in the coast redwood predominantly has been infrequent, with low severity, which occurred from lightning strikes, usually during the rainy season. The occurrence of lightning storms in the dry season, such as the one that preceded the CZU Lightning Complex Fire, are historically rare, but these can have a significant impact when they happen. Coast redwood with a high crown and thick bark is adapted to withstand fire. They have vigorous clonal sprouting ability, and also damaged tree can replace canopy with a few months through epicormic sprouting. Douglas fir is a co-dominant canopy species with relatively thick bark, which helps them to withstand fire, but they only rely on regeneration from seed. Tan oak is most abundant subcanopy species in the central and southern range of the coast redwood forest, followed by Pacific madrone, California bay, and several oak species. And all these species have little resistance to fire, but do have the ability to sprout post-fire. The goal of this study was to estimate the survival and recovery of coast redwood and its associated tree species and the understory species to find out if severe fire gives a successional advantage to particular species or not. The study area was in Big Basin State Park in the central old growth section of the park, as well as the areas around the campsites. And this limitation was due to the hazardous condition and lack of access to more remote areas of the park at the time. I randomly selected 30 circular plots with a 20-meter diameter for each plot. And at the center of each plot, I measured slope and aspect, percent canopy cover. And within each plot, I recorded burn severity by measuring scorch height, tree size and height, and I did ocular assessment of post-survivalship and sprout along the bole, measured the sapling size, and also counted the basal sprout for 3 different height classes. Number of seedlings were counted, and finally measured the understory species richness and abundance. And the data were collected between March to April of 2021. A total of 487 individual trees of 6 species were recorded within the sample plots, including 2 coniferous canopy of redwood and Douglas fir, and 4 hardwood subcanopy species of tan oak, Pacific wax myrtle, and Pacific madrone. 85% of trees sampled survived the fire based on the presence of live canopy or basal sprouting. Redwood showed the highest overall survival, and Douglas fir was the lowest. Also, redwood and Douglas fir trees that survived had significantly higher measure of diameter and height than those that did not survive. The bole char height range on mature tree was between 0 to 59 meters. The highest average bole char occurred on Douglas fir, which was about 19-meter high, followed by coast redwood about 14-meter. As we see in this figure, live crown retention was low following the fire, but there was a big variation among species. Redwood showed the highest percentage of tree with crown retention, and oak had the next highest measure, while no crown was observed for Pacific wax myrtle. Also, percent cover of the residual live canopy was positively associated with tree height and diameter for all tree species combined. We saw vigorous sprouting in response to fire for all tree species, with the exception of Douglas fir, which does not have a sprouting ability. The highest average number of basal sprout per individual tree was for redwood, about 32 sprout per tree. Also, the number of basal sprouts for all species sprouting combined as dependent variables showed a positive linear relationship with both tree height and tree diameter as independent variable. Also, linear relationship were observed for redwood and tan oak between basal sprouting and tree height and tree diameter. In addition to basal regeneration, the scorch bole of many redwood trees survived the fire, and they responded by sprouting epicormically, as we can see in these pictures. There was a positive correlation between tree height and diameter and epicormic sprouting on the main stem. Recovery of understory species from both sprouts and seed was slightly less than 4% of the total cover across the samples. 16 species were recorded on the burn plots, and with huckleberry was the most abundant one. which was able to regenerate from basal sprout and underground rhizomes. All these 16 species were native plants. However, outside the sample area, we observed some invasive non-native species of French broom. So to conclude, analysis of initial recovery suggests a successional advantage for redwood over its coniferous co-dominant Douglas fir. The recovery of Douglas fir will depend on seed availability and germination over time. And 6 months after the fire, we did not record any seedling for any species, as a matter of fact, in the sample plots. And the prolonged drought in California may also affect the recruitment of seedling as well. Additional sampling will be necessary to determine if Douglas fir recruitment will expand in the coming seasons. Species with more vigorous sprouting will likely gain greater relative dominance, and in our case, tan oak and oak may have a greater competitive advantage under a high severity fire regime. It will be many years until we fully understand the influence of this fire on the forest community. But what we know is redwood tree is extremely resilient, and even if it appears to be lifeless, it will often recover. Therefore, post-fire seedling or removal of scorched down tree is not recommended in this forest type. Also, reduction of canopy through hazard tree removal could work in favor of invasive species such as the French broom. Thank you so much all for your attention, and for further information, I also posted the link to our research on the next slide.
Great, thank you so much. We have time for some questions in the chat. So if folks have questions, please write them in. The first question we have here is comparing understory species. How do we ensure that non-native species do not become dominant after regularly prescribed burns?
Well, the goal is, as the canopy will close, these non-native species will die down, hopefully. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we have to wait for canopy regrowth. Another question from someone is asking about, here, sorry, let me pull it up. From YouTube is asking, will there be follow-up studies to see if understory plants do start to come back? So some of these ones like Douglas fir.
Yes, definitely. This was for my undergraduate senior seminar project. So for my graduate, I will be going back and continue the same research.
Great. Do folks have other questions? Oh yeah, so since Douglas fir seems to be at a disadvantage, are there any plans to do plantings of this species?
We have to ask from park services. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we may be able to ask Portia if Portia would want to answer that. We can see. Another question, how many years do you suspect it'll take the canopy to grow back?
Decades. I'm not quite sure at this point, yeah.
And then David Wild, I'm going to keep your question for, we have a few studies about mycorrhizal relationships in the park. So we'll keep that for a little bit later in the program. Okay, let me check YouTube just to see if there's any other questions here. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'm going to ask, is Christian Schwartz, our next speaker, is he here? And if so, could he raise his hand? Because maybe his name isn't up here yet. Okay, so oh, here is Christian. Christian's here.
Hi there. Yeah.
Great. Are you ready to go?
Yep. I just, for some reason, was in another account.
Okay. No worries. Great. Thank you. So you should be able to share your screen and we can move from there. Christian is a researcher at the University of University of California, Santa Cruz, and he'll be talking to us about fungal response to the fire. And we're going to move and shift gears into fungi for the next couple talks. So Christian, and then he'll be followed by Caroline, who'll be talking about mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see if I can get my screen share going here. Can everyone see that? Look good? Okay. Hey, everybody. So yeah, I am at UC Santa Cruz, the Norris Center for Natural History. I teach natural history of fungi there, but something that I've been doing for the past 3 years was long-term monitoring of macrofungi in Santa Cruz. And all that means is that I was spending a lot of time visiting the same sites over and over at relatively short time scales. So at 10-day intervals or so, and recording the dynamics of abundance and diversity of macrofungi on these 10 transects throughout Santa Cruz County. So I call this the LTMM project, and it was sponsored by the Save the Redwoods League. So I was collecting data on this for 3 years. I had no intention of it having anything to do with fire, but as with California ecology in general these days, you end up encountering fire whether or not you had planned on it. So I had 10 transects that were scattered over Ben Lomond Mountain, as well as 8 on Ben Lomond Mountain and 2 in Nicene Marks, so in a different watershed, totally different system. But of the 8 that were on Ben Lomond Mountain, 3 of them were in Big Basin proper, and 1 of them was down in Fall Creek. So here's sort of the aggregation of where my transects were across the county. And I did these transects over 3 different rainy seasons. So 2018, 2019, 2019, 2020, and then 2020, 2021. So I did have 1 year post-fire. Some basic sort of results from these survey transects is that all of them are extremely diverse, and they were all chosen because they're redwood dominated transects. So these are all sort of similar in the sense that they don't have a lot of other tree diversity. I mean, they do have other trees present, but they're all dominated by redwoods. And, you know, each transect had over 300 species present. The transects are 1 kilometer long, and I'm only surveying about, 2 or 3 meters on either side of the trail. So extreme diversity of macrofungi, even on relatively small areas in this redwood forest. Overall, summing all of the transects together, we got close to 600 species. And as we started to plot this data, we started to be able to visualize some of the dynamics that are intuitively visible to a naturalist who spends time looking for mushrooms in coastal California. There is such a thing as a mushroom season. There's lower diversity, lower abundance at the beginning. During the middle of winter, when it's wettest and the soil moisture is highest, there's more diversity and more abundance generally, and then it tapers off through April. But the exact shape of this curve changes from year to year. So once we got 3 years of data in, we were able to start plotting somewhat more finely what these dynamics look like. And I'm actually working with Jesse Miller from Stanford. We're trying to figure out ways to explore the patterns of functional trait presence at different points in the season over the 3 years. But that's still in progress right now. As you all know, 2020 was an extremely consequential year for the Santa Cruz Mountains bioregion, and especially for Ben Lomond Mountain. The CZU fire was centered on Ben Lomond Mountain, especially Big Basin and the upper reaches of the mountain. And 4 of my transects were affected by the CZU fire. So I ended up getting 2 years of baseline data that we'll never be able to get again. I feel really lucky that by complete accident, I got 2 seasons of survey time in Big Basin and Fall Creek before they burned, because I don't really expect that the park will ever look the way it did from a fungal perspective in my lifetime. So I felt lucky to get this baseline data, and then I was able to also get the first year of post-fire data in 2020/2021, that wet season. And something that I just want to sort of touch on as where potential future research into fire and its effects on fungi might go using Big Basin as a study site is when we think about plants, we think about a range of adaptations to fire. For example, Douglas fir is relatively fire intolerant. Tan oak is sensitive, which is to say it does suffer some fitness consequences from fire, but it's resilient. It can root sprout. It did that really impressively after the fire. Redwood is quite fire tolerant. It has adaptations specifically to insulate, standing trees from fire, and they can regenerate really quickly through epicormic sprouting and just insulating their main trunks. And then we have things that are fire stimulated. They actually respond better to fire or have a pronounced flush of reproductive activity in the years following fires, like Calochortus, Mariposa lilies. And we saw that in Big Basin as well. I don't know how many of you were able to see the carpets of Calochortus tolmii that lined the edges of the road after the CZU fire, but it really showed that being a geophyte, having this big storage organ underground that you can regenerate from, is a good strategy to last through these sort of perturbations. And then there's things like the Santa Cruz Mountain beard tongue, which isn't exactly stimulated by fire. I mean, it is. You're certainly going to find more of it potentially in areas that have been cleared out by fire, but it is sort of ephemeral. It sort of like dies back as canopy closure starts to take hold in the years following a fire, whereas something like a Mariposa lily has a little bit more persistence. It has a permanent underground structure, whereas this beard tongue is sort of an annual. It's likely to sort of disappear as that disturbance becomes less evident in the landscape as time goes on. So the question is, what range of adaptations to fire do we find in macrofungi? Do we have similar categories? And what species belong to each of these categories? And curiously, really, we mostly know the fire-associated fungi. We have good guesses about mushrooms that are associated with being fire stimulated or fire following, but we don't know the other end of the spectrum being very well. We don't know what mycelia are extremely fire intolerant. We don't know what species really have a hard time bouncing back from fire. One of our first guesses might be that anything that is a strict mycorrhizal associate of Douglas fir will follow the exact same pattern of its host. If its host is fire intolerant, it, by proxy, is also fire intolerant because it's an obligate symbiont of that tree that is no longer really present in Big Basin right now. At least there's no mature Douglas firs in a lot of the most severely burned areas. But there may even be other fungi that turn out to be fire sensitive or fire intolerant, regardless of their sort of knock-on one-to-one effects with a particular host. Here's an example of a mushroom that we did not know had any particular response to fire before this event, before the CZU fire, but because of my pre and post-fire transect data, we were able to show that, before the fire, it was present very commonly in old-growth redwood forests, but never very abundantly. It was something you expect to see, but only a few fruit bodies here and there, maybe 1 to 7 fruit bodies on an average transect. But in the year after the fire, in the heavily burned transects in Big Basin, I found 125 fruit bodies on my first visit, and the next time I found 493 fruit bodies. So it went from being a single-digit order of magnitude to hundreds and hundreds. In some places, 100 altogether in one spot, just a few meters square. So this is clearly a mushroom that has a fire response. It's probably not fire obligate because we see it everywhere, even in non-burned areas. It's very common, but it clearly benefited or had some sort of capacity to capitalize on the change in soil structure and was able to have this big reproductive event in the immediate aftermath of the fire. So that deserves some more investigation. It's a really interesting new facet, new dimension of its life history that was not previously known. So here's an example of what that looks like. This species doesn't normally fruit like this, but this is, I think, November, December, right after the fire. This is an example of a mushroom that was well known to be a fire obligate. When you get Anthracobia, literally references in Latin coal, charcoal. And it is anywhere you get a fire in California that turns the surface litter into charcoal, you expect to see large fruitings of this ascomycete that seems to be sort of a specialist on reproductive events being timed around fire. Lentoporia is an example of a polypore that we really did not know was present in the park, but in the immediate aftermath, the very first survey that I went on after the fire in, I think, November, it was a dominant species on all of these burned Douglas fir and redwoods that were fruiting there. So a lot of the story of what my post-fire surveys revealed was that there's this hidden diversity, or there's hidden dimensions of life histories to familiar fungi that would never have been revealed had I not been able to experience this kind of rare kind of disturbance, at least in this system. Daleomyces phillipsi, this is not necessarily something you can tell from the photo, but this mushroom is about as big as a basketball. It's a huge mushroom. And it is the fruiting body of a species that is probably living as an endophyte within tan oak trees while they're alive. And only after they're killed by the fire does the reproductive part of the fungus's life cycle happen. I'm guessing this is a little bit speculative, what I'm saying right now, but based on my natural history observations of what happened in Big Basin after the fire, it seems likely that we're going to learn that many more of the fungi have this sort of dual life cycle where they're sort of quiescent as endophytes during the majority of their life, and then after disturbance, they appear and do their reproductive phase. Here's an example of something that was totally unknown prior to the fire. I showed up at Fall Creek one day during one of my post-fire transect surveys, and there were literally tens of thousands of this mushroom, and I had never seen it before. And it was a big mushroom, you know, not at all something small and inconspicuous. There was just, I was surrounded by functionally an unknown entity. UFO had showed up on my transect in huge numbers. And eventually we got some DNA sequences back, and it turns out, well, this is just to show you how dense the fruitings were. It's hard to see because the caps are brown, but I've highlighted them here with red dots. Just in this 3 meter square area, there's 300 fruit bodies. Like, you could lay down and be surrounded by hundreds of fruit bodies just around, you know, the outline of your body in a single patch of this burned forest. But when we got the DNA sequences back for this species, it turned out that its closest relative was only discovered just a few years prior, also after a mega fire event, but on the other side of the country in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So whatever is going on with this hygrocebi, is the genus that it's in, something about this clade of organisms, this particular group of mushrooms, is responding to fire. There's something about their life history that's tied to fire, even across highly disparate systems that span a huge geographic range across the continent. So something really interesting is going on here. Really deserves more investigation. So what does the future hold for these forests and these fungi? And the answer is, I don't know. And I think it's going to take a lot more people looking. I'm really excited to hear, you know, the talk that comes right after me about also focuses on fungi. It's really unclear to me what the future holds for mushrooms specifically, the biodiversity of macrofungi in Big Basin. I think it will have a lot to do with what the prevailing climatic regime ends up looking like. So almost more than any on the ground direct mitigation of conservation, I think that
I don't know, but like
I think someone's muted.
whatever
Mic is
reason,
unmuted.
started the share and presentation mode.
Zane, is your mic unmuted?
Not.
Sorry, it was that was Sky. I
Oh,
muted.
no worries.
Sorry.
I think more importantly than any direct conservation intervention, it's going to be the luck of the draw. It's going to depend largely on how much carbon we continue to pump into the air globally, and what sort of extremely diffuse and unpredictable effects that has on our local weather regime. And I don't think that anyone is in a position to predict that very finely. If these trees suffer an impact like they did in the CZU fire and then are faced with 2 decades of increasing severe drought, I don't think there's any amount of conservation that we can do on the ground that will bring Big Basin back to what it looked like. So I don't expect the biodiversity of fungi to be similar to what it was in my lifetime, and maybe never. I don't feel that trajectory is likely. We do seem to be getting evidence that whatever rainy season we're left with in California will be shorter and more punctuated, with less of a lead up in fall and less of a drawdown in spring. And that certainly is going to change the fruiting dynamics and reproductive capacity of all the mushrooms that depend on that water for their reproductive part of their life cycle. So it's very uncertain, but clearly the patchiness of sensitive host trees and sensitive habitat types and the regeneration is going to be a major influence on whatever fungi we do see coming back in the Big Basin in the coming years. And in the meantime, the least we can do is to witness it. So I really encourage the folks at the state parks and any of these sort of nonprofits that focus on the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Redwood bioregion to encourage people simply to go in and document what is going on, because this is sort of a first opportunity. No one knows what a severely burned redwood forest looks like from the perspective of its macrofungal community. So we are witnessing for the first time that story. So it's really critical that we get out there and document as much of it as we can if we hope to understand it in the future. This is just an example of one of the silver linings of this kind of burn, but I went and slept up in the burn zone the spring after the fire, and I camped out there and set up a moth light one night, and thought I saw this sort of drab looking gray moth, and it turned out to be the first living specimen ever photographed. So even in these really devastated landscapes, there's so much biological discovery still to do. It can be really exciting, even though people like me who are familiar with Big Basin before it burned, it sometimes feels rather difficult and painful to be there. I really encourage people, if you haven't yet been to visit the post-fire zone, there is a lot going on biologically, and there are new things to learn about the bioregion that we all call home. So thanks to Save the Redwoods League for funding this, and thanks to Zane for putting this symposium on tonight and for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Christian. We really appreciate your talk. We have a couple minutes for questions, but then we really do need to move on. My question is, do you think the mycelia or the spores of these fire following fungi, those are surviving in the soil? And why would the spores of these other fungi that are getting burned and extirpated out of the park, why don't those spores survive? Or is it not a spore survival thing?
That's a great question. And for some of them, it is a spore survival thing. And for some of them, it is a mycelium survival thing. Just like with plants, there are annuals and perennials in fungi. So there are some fungi where their resting stage is mycelial and it's deep down in the soil and it's insulated enough that it survives through the fire. There are other fungi that do a lot of their life cycle by just resporulating in place or nearby from year to year, like an annual plant does. And so we might expect those things to take longer to return. There's also simply differences in spore morphology. Some spores are highly defended with very thick walls with lots of melanin, make them extremely resistant to dehydration. Other fungi have really thin cell walls and they're not pigmented, so they dry out or they're UV damaged really quickly. So there's a huge range of possible variations and reasons why persistence or extirpation might occur. And there's really little data. We don't know very much about that from the perspective of the whole community.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question asking about whether there's any studies of slime molds in the park.
Oh boy. I mean, there were certainly people going there documenting slime molds before the fire. I don't know that there was ever sort of a full inventory taken, but I know some of you probably know Allison Pollock, who has gotten extremely, a lot of attention recently for her extremely beautiful macro work on slime molds in Central California. But we're hoping to get her there in this winter to sort of document whatever slime molds are there now. I don't know how to answer that any further, but I certainly hope that people will turn their attention to it.
Great, thanks. Another question, the final one, and then we'll have to move on. Are there evidences of change in soil composition, organic and inorganic, pre-post fire, which may be triggering the change in fungal diversity?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the ash layer has big chemical implications for the soil immediately under it. You know, you get a big change in pH, you get a big change in the free nutrients, you get a big change in soil texture and water holding capacity. But no one knows in any sort of robust way what the mechanistic implications are for the mycelial sort of ability to persist in that soil, especially not for the whole community. We're talking hundreds of species, all of which likely have slightly different tolerances and response variables that they're sensitive to. So absolutely, there was a shift in some fungi. It is known that these sudden pH changes actually trigger fruiting. So a lot of the fire following fungi are known to fruit after a sudden increase in pH. And that's exactly what we saw. But what the long-term consequences look like, I'm finding out just alongside you.
Cool. Thank you so much. We're going to move now towards the soil end of things and mycorrhizal fungi with Carolyn Dawes, who's a PhD candidate at Stanford University. Let me take it away, Carolyn. You should be able to share your screen now.
Let's see here. How is that?
Looks great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for putting this together, Zane. This has been really fun. And I was excited to hear Christian talk about the macrofungi in Big Basin. I am excited to talk to you today about the microbial fungi that are in the soils in Big Basin. I will admit that I am a microbial ecologist by training and pretty new to the fire world. So I'm really grateful to be hearing from so many experts in this redwood forest fire realm today. So you're probably pretty familiar with what these forests look like above ground after fire, but of course I'm pretty interested in what is going on below ground. And just as Christian was saying, there are some of these fungi that you can see. So some of these changes in the soil we can see because there are these fruiting bodies. Here's another photo of Anthracobia that's fruiting after fire. But I am really interested in thinking about the things that we can't even see with the naked eye. And so I will have to suffice with some diagrams for now until we get to the data. But when I look at this forest, I'm thinking about these sort of two major canopy species, redwood and Doug fir. And I'm thinking about all of the different kinds of microbes that are in the soil. Today, I'm just going to be talking about fungi, but of course, there are a lot of bacteria in the soil as well. And I really want to know, okay, when a fire burns this landscape, what happens? Are some of the microbes in the soil more affected than others? So I'll be asking similar questions here today, but I'm going to be thinking about how this high severity wildfire affects the microbial fungal communities and what that might mean for forest function in the future. So when we look at this landscape, I went out to Big Basin in December 2020 and January 2021, and it looks like maybe I'm frozen. Am I back?
Yeah, we can see your video. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I went out in December 2020 and January 2021 to sample some soils from different areas in the park. So most of our burned sites came from within the park, but we weren't able to safely access unburned sites within the park. And so the unburned sites that we have come from Portola Redwood State Park and from the Waterman Gap area. But luckily, one of my colleagues, Dr. Claire Willing, had done a study in Big Basin on soil microbes in 2016 inside the park, and we were able to resample her site. So I'll talk a little bit later about the comparison between the fungi that she found in the soil in 2016 before it burned and the changes that we saw after the burn in 2020. So you may be familiar, but we found a lot of really interesting changes in both the sort of canopy level that we heard about earlier and also on the ground floor. So someone was just asking about soil changes. So you can see here that in the unburned area, there's this really thick layer of duff, but when we get down to a high severity burn zone, there's basically no litter left on the ground. And this is a really different kind of environment to find microbes in. And so these were sort of interesting visual changes for us to see. And you might be asking, well, how can we count things that we can't see? So Christian can go out and he can count the macrofungi, but we do not have that luxury thinking about microfungi. And so we can actually take these cores, take a subsample of soil. There are thousands of fungal cells in here. There's up to kilometers of hyphae in some of these soils. And we can extract the DNA, we can pool and sequence it. And this is how we're able to count the different kinds of fungal species that are in the soil that we're finding. And so I'm going to just try to walk a little bit through the conceptual diagram here of how we can think about visualizing these data of many, many, many species of fungi at once. And so I'm going to be showing some of these plots where the number on the axes don't really mean a whole lot. But all I want you to pay attention to is whether the points, which are going to represent individual soil cores that I took throughout the park, whether they're close together, which indicates that they share a lot of species. So there's a lot of the same fungi in those two soil cores, or whether they're far apart. And that means that they don't share a lot of the same species, or they share them in really different abundances. And so to walk through kind of a prediction here, if we think that fire is going to majorly restructure these microfungi communities, then we'll expect to see a separation of these soil cores on this plot according to fire severity, which I'm going to show in these three colors, where red is high severity fire, orange is moderate, and the green-blue color is an unburned site. We might also see that fire doesn't majorly restructure these communities, and so we would expect to see a lot of overlap in that case. So I'm going to show you the data now. So I'm going to be showing you points that are colored by fire severity, and also I'm going to show you the sites that I was able to borrow from my collaborator Claire that are in these open circles. So the dark circles are the ones that I took after the fire in 2020. And all I want you to notice here is that the orange and red points are clustering together separately from the green points. And that we see that the green points, which were within the park, but before the fire, are clustering with those unburned sites. So this suggests to us that these changes in the microbial community are probably actually due to the fire itself and not because of the distance between the places where we were able to sample safely after the fire. So the next question that I had is, okay, well, if these communities are different, how are they different? What is the compositional difference between these communities? So the first thing that we're going to look at is a couple of different patterns of change for different fungal groups after fire according to burn severity. So I'm going to shift from thinking about burn as a category and using this layer that I was given from CAL FIRE about burn severity. So it's just a metric where yellow is unburned or low severity burn, and this dark purple color is high severity burn. And first, I'm going to be thinking about diversity. So we could think of this sort of as like the number of species. So what happens to the number of species of fungi after fire? And so we find that wildfire pretty significantly reduces fungal diversity. So we had a really strong pattern of a decline in the number of fungal species that we saw. And the next question that I have in thinking about what this is going to mean for forests is, okay, how are the fungi that are associated with plants specifically going to be affected by fire? And I'm going to think about two groups today. Of course, there are a lot of different kinds of groups that we could think about, but today I'm going to be talking a little bit about mutualists. So those are the fungi that are interacting in a mutually beneficial way with plant species. And I'm going to talk a little bit about plant pathogens. So those fungi that are benefiting from the plants but causing illness or disease or mortality in the plants. And so the first mutualist that I'm going to talk about is mycorrhizal fungi. Somebody's been asking questions about this already, but in case you haven't heard of this before, mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that are associating in the roots of these trees. The trees are making sugar from photosynthesis, and the fungi are scavenging for nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil in exchange. And we know that these are really important. They make these huge mycelial mats. So here, all this white tissue is actually just fungal tissue on the roots of this pine seedling. And we know that they can be really important for growth. So if we grow seedlings in the greenhouse with or without these mycorrhizal fungal partners, we see that there are really big consequences for growth. And something that's really interesting to me, especially about the forests in Big Basin, is that these two codominant canopy species, redwood and Doug fir, they don't associate with the same kind of mycorrhizal fungi. And so redwoods are associating with a kind of mycorrhizal fungi we call arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and Douglas fir are associating with a kind of mycorrhizal fungi we call ectomycorrhizal fungi. And I'm not going to go into detail about what the specific differences are, but it is sort of notable that the ectomycorrhizal fungi they might make fruiting bodies. So some of your favorite edibles are probably ectomycorrhizal fungi, and the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are not making fruiting bodies. So that's why we have to use these sequencing techniques to compare these two things. So first up, we saw that there was a really drastic decrease in the abundance of ectomycorrhizal fungi with fire. So whereas there was a really wide range of ectomycorrhizal abundance in our different soil cores before fire, we saw that there was a really quick drop off, but there was still some ectomycorrhizal presence after fire. Now, for arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, these are the redwood associates, we found that there was a wide range of abundance in the unburned sites, but that there was virtually no arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that's at least sequenceable in these cores, even at sort of a moderate burn severity. But at the same time, I also wanted to talk about these negative interactions. So the abundance of pathogens increased really significantly with fire. So we're seeing that there's some net, probably negative effect of these microbes where they're losing their beneficial partners, but there's an increase in these plant pathogens. And so the question that I'm sort of interested in thinking about is what this might mean for seedlings. And so we talked earlier about how So the main question for this part will be how these fungal community changes are going to affect redwoods and Doug firs maybe differently in the seedling stage. So earlier we heard a lot about resprouting. We know that resprouting is a really important thing going on. I'm particularly interested in seedling dynamics because just as we were talking about before, these forests are experiencing really novel climate regimes, and they're going to need the genetic diversity that they get from germinating from seed in order to maybe have a chance at adapting. So I'm sort of interested in thinking about comparing just the seedling stage, even though we know that redwoods can resprout and Doug fir not resprout. So how might the changes in the microbial communities affect the growth of these seedlings? So I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about this experiment today, but we took seeds of both Doug fir and redwood. We grew up these seedlings in a greenhouse experiment where we really wanted to think about the role of microbes in seedling sort of biomass, growth, health, fitness after fire. And I'm just going to show sort of one major highlight, but we found that the microbes are actually maybe going to change the dynamics of competition between these two species that depends on fire severity. So we actually found that whereas we would predict with this mathematical model coexistence of these two seedling species before fire, after a moderate severity fire, the microbes are benefiting Doug fir more than they're benefiting redwood. But after a high severity fire, the microbes are benefiting redwood more than they're benefiting Doug fir. So I have a lot of questions here, and I'm still thinking about this and actively doing analysis and writing this up. But overall, I'm just excited to be here and thinking about these questions and thinking about what this might mean for the long-term forest composition of Big Basin forests. I have a lot of people to thank in this work. I primarily want to thank the stewards of the land that I work on at Stanford, the Muwekma people, and also thank the Amamutton Tribal Band, who are the stewards of the Big Basin area, which is the historical lands of the Awaswas people. I have a lot of collaborators and helpers and undergrads and colleagues to thank and some funding sources, but I would love to take any questions that you might have now.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was great. I think it's fascinating seeing the difference between Douglas fir and redwood seedling recruitment dependent on burn severity. I would have never guessed that. We have one question about if you could just define what burn severity is. I know it's go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just talk about what I'm talking about in my study with burn severity. But here we were just using a metric of burn severity that was taken from an aerial visual image that basically classifies using the reflectance from that image on a scale from 1 to 254. So it's not perfect. It doesn't always capture sort of the ground burn dynamics, but we found that there were almost no places where so we went to visually sort of check this out, and there were almost no places where we thought that there was no burn and there had been burn. So it was a pretty good indicator of what was going on. But we did end up combining low and moderate severity fire sites because they were a little bit hard to distinguish visually compared to what the data were showing from the aerial image. If that answers your question.
Great, thanks. Another question is, how do mycorrhizal fungi survive in the soil after a fire? Is it spores? Is it mycelium? Is it something else?
Yeah, great question. So there are a lot of different strategies going on here, but certainly some of them are surviving as spores. Some of these spores have these, Christian was describing this earlier, but they have these sort of tougher spores that can survive heat more than others. So there can be sort of a spore bank in the same way that there's a seed bank in the soil. But I think something that's probably playing a huge role here, and that I think there could be a lot of work looking even now at what's going on sort of in the field, is that there are these surviving roots, right? So there are these redwood trees that have survived. They're still colonized probably by these fungi. And so it's likely that we could get colonization of new seedlings from mycelial network that's in the soil that has survived. Even for Doug fir, if they die, there are some ectomycorrhizal fungi that are also hosted on tan oak. And we see that tan oak resprout really successfully after fire as well. So I think that there's probably some combination here of both spores that survive the fire, mycelial networks in the soil that it can recolonize new seedlings, and also that new spores are being blown into this area from surviving stands nearby. This is a really heterogeneous fire. And so over time, you'll get a recolonization of those spores from other areas.
So then another question of mine is, it seems like redwoods, we talk about redwoods adaptations to fire, right? And it seems, though, that redwoods have a disadvantage when the burn severity increases. Those arbuscular mycorrhizae seem to just completely die out. So that was shocking. I didn't think that would be the case. Is there any understanding of why that is?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions too. I think that part of it is the sort of limited nature of the sequencing technology that we have. So we probably aren't picking up on all of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that are in the soil. I sort of have a hunch that because the redwoods are able to survive fire better, the adults are, that there is probably going to be recolonization of those arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and maybe it just wasn't on the time scale that we went and sampled just a couple of months after the fire. So I wish we had done a sort of a time series analysis where we were able to see sort of the recovery of these organisms over time. But certainly I think that there are going to be effects of those mycorrhizal fungi, but also that maybe there are these differential effects of the pathogens as well that are affecting the redwood success.
Great. And along those lines, someone was asking if it could be measured, this mycorrhizal recolonization. So could you explain really quickly what a time series is? And
yes,
what you mean by that?
Yeah. So a time series, I basically wish that we had done sort of what Christian has done in going back to the same transects over and over, but we could take soil samples over and over. But interestingly, here I've sequenced to look at all of the fungi that are in the soil, but you could actually go and dig up roots of living, surviving trees, and you could visually assess the colonization of those roots. So the ectomycorrhizae you can actually just see with the naked eye, and we can count them with a sort of low-powered microscope. And the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, we can clear the roots of their pigments and stain them with a blue dye, and we can look at them under a more powerful microscope, and we can visually assess colonization that way. So we're actually hoping to go back to the park sometime this year and think about whether we have correlation between the fungi that we saw in the soil more than a year ago now, and what the sort of current colonization state is of both the adult trees and any new seedlings or saplings that have been able to establish since then.
Great, thanks. I think so. We have a couple more questions here. I'm trying to synthesize them. One from Jen and one from David Wild about how we know about heats at different depths of the soil and how we measure that, and what it looked like in this fire, and then we'll have to move on.
Yeah, great. So soil is pretty insulating, so we can expect that sort of the lower down you go in the soil, the less that these soils will be affected by heat sort of directly. But there are also these chemical changes that are happening. And so we didn't do a sampling of the soil at a really sort of fine gradient of depth, but there are some studies out there that have found really, really important differences between the fungi that are found to survive on the surface. For instance, you lose basically all of the litter fungi because all of the litter is gone, and so they were just primarily living in the litter. But for some of those fungi that either have rhizomes that are sort of deeper in the soil or have spores that are deeper in the soil, they're probably surviving better just because the heat is less penetrating into the soil.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you so much. We'll have to move on. There's a lot of questions that we just don't have, have the time for. So with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Allison Nelson. And thank you so much, Caroline. Allison Nelson is a director at the Gold County Avian Studies, and she'll be talking to us about hermit thrush populations.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's actually Gold Country Avian Studies, and even though I am in Nevada City, I actually love to go to Big Basin and do my work, some of my work there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can you guys see that okay?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for having me. I have been studying hermit thrushes since about 2012 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And hermit thrushes, they're just fascinating. So for those of you who are familiar with them, they just are they have these beautiful songs that echo through the redwood forest, and so they've just always captivated me. And Big Basin is a fantastic place to study them. So what I want to do tonight is just give you a little bit of a background on hermit thrushes in California, tell you what we know about the subspecies of hermit thrush that breeds in Big Basin. I'm going to give you some info on my past research on hermit thrushes in the park, and then tell you what we learned about hermit thrushes from my post-fire research in Big Basin. So let's see. So, okay. So California, hermit thrushes in California are super interesting because you have hermit thrushes that breed, so they're migratory species, right? And so they breed in one area and then they migrate to their overwintering grounds. And so in the winter in California, you have hermit thrushes in lots of different habitats at many different elevations. But in the summer, you really only have breeders in high elevation areas. They're not in the Central Valley or the deserts or lower elevation areas. And so this map is of the breeding ranges in the different subspecies breeding ranges that are in California. So there's a number of them, and they a lot of these subspecies were defined by early researchers through variation in study skins. Based on their subspecies are based on color or wing length, etc. And so, but what happens in California is it's something called chain migration, where you have wintering birds that move north to their breeding grounds. And as they're heading north, hermit thrushes that were breeding further south, maybe in Mexico, head north to arrive in California, and specifically in the Bay Area. And so if you take a quick look at this map, the subspecies that's in Big Basin, Cathaurus guttatus sloveni, you can see that the southern extent of this subspecies breeding range pretty much stops at Big Basin. They are kind of sparsely distributed further south from that. And then as you head north, there's actually debate about how far north the extent of this breeding subspecies occurs. We're not sure whether it's a different subspecies or there's intergrades, et cetera. And so that's one of the things that's always fascinated me about hermit thrushes in California. And so in 2022, I co-authored a paper with Allison Alvarado, and she created a hermit thrush genoscape, which is essentially a map of genetic variation within the species across its breeding range in North America. And so you can see over here in the coast of California, each one of these dots is a different sampling site. So you can see over here on the coast of California, these two, we've got a couple sites here at Big Basin, one to the north in Point Reyes. This orange color indicates that they are genetically distinct from the ones over here in the Rockies. They're distinct from the ones in the Sierra and also elsewhere through North America. Last summer and the summer prior, I went to a number of places in different state parks along the coast of California to try to collect blood samples, take measurements, and record songs of hermit thrushes up along the coast. So from those in that area where we're not really sure what's going on, we wanted to get some blood samples and see if we could get a little bit better idea of where this variation or where this sort of boundary between different genetic groups or different subspecies occurs. And so one of the interesting preliminary, we're still the genetics work on those samples is down the road, but one of the preliminary findings from the song analysis is that so this is a discriminant function analysis graph, and essentially each one of these dots is an individual song, And so the closer together the dots are, the more similar the song characteristics are. So these parks here along this kind of north central coast of California are kind of clustered here in one group. And then the ones up in Del Norte Redwood State Park are distinct. And then over here further to the east, you've got birds that are distinct. So you have these, sort of three factors: song, genetics, subspecies, morphology, that's indicating that the group of birds that is breeding in Big Basin is somewhat distinct from other hermit thrushes. And Big Basin, prior to the fire, was just a really fascinating place to study hermit thrushes because you have this beautiful overstory of the old growth redwoods and Doug firs. You have the understory of the huckleberries, which is great nesting substrate and cover for protection against predators. They provide berries in the fall, which help them fatten up for migration. And then you also have this mid canopy of tan oaks, which when they drop their leaf litter, they provide this perfect camouflage for hermit thrushes, which are typically foraging on the ground. So I first started working in Big Basin in 2013, and I established 2 field sites at the Creeping Forest Trail and along Blooms Creek. And that year we just banded birds, took measurements, got blood samples. Then in 2014, we put geolocators on 20 hermit thrushes, and in 2015 got those back. And those are devices that you can use to track migration, identify areas where the birds went on the alternate time within their annual cycle. Anyhow, so the birds in Big Basin, we found that were wintering down in Baja and Western Mexico. Each of these red dots is an individual, and the red lines are essentially like error bars. So I had these 3 years of data from prior to the fire, where I was capturing the birds, recording the sex and et cetera of the birds that I found, and marking locations. We were mist netting, capturing them with mist nets, and then releasing them. So unfortunately, in August 2020, CZU Lightning Complex Fire hit. Both of my field sites burned, and when I was returned in summer of 2021, both of my field sites were actually still had some reburns occurring with things starting from root fires, et cetera. So we wanted to get at what had happened with the population of these birds, try to figure out a way to compare their populations prior to the fire and after the fire. So the first thing we did was use GIS data to create a map of the habitat available to hermit thrushes pre-fire. So this shape outline is actually the extent of the park. And then we used a couple of different factors to identify how much of the full acreage of the park was good habitat for hermit thrushes. And so of those approximately 18,000 acres of the park, we found that about 15,900 provided appropriate hermit thrush habitat for breeding. And then what we did is post-fire, we took Sentinel-2 satellite data that was recorded soon after the fire, that we accessed. It was already bend into fire severity measurements. So basically, fire severity measures the loss of organic vegetative matter. And so the areas that are red were high severity fire, and then progressing down to green. So about 64% of the park is high severity fire, medium high 17%, et cetera. This is just a quick example. On the left, you might, again, these pictures were taken a year after the fire occurred. So on the left, we have a low, what might be more considered a low severity fire, where you have some retained dead foliage. Most of what is occurring, besides the redwoods, most of what is occurring above the ground was dead. It's resprouting, but it did at least provide cover and structure for the birds to use as habitat. On the right is a more high severity fire. This is a site with a location within one of my field sites that reburned. So it actually burned twice, and there's just really no vegetation left whatsoever on the ground. So I'm just going to kind of run through this quickly, but essentially what I did was I took to get at a pre-fire territory density, which then we could use to estimate pre-fire population. We used my netting locations from 2013, 2014, and 2015. Buffered that area to create sort of these two field these two study areas within at my study sites, and based on the number of birds captured, averaged a territory arrived at a average territory density for the 3 years that I was capturing birds pre-fire, and that territory density was 0.13 territories per acre, which when applied to the whole habitable area of the park was about 2,000 territories, or 2,000 mated pairs possible within the park. So then post-fire, I wasn't capturing any birds. I was doing spot mapping. We were actually out there recording all detections or observations of the birds. Hermit thrushes countersing, which if you've ever heard, it's just an absolutely amazing experience. So you'll have 2 males that will be singing, or 3 or 4 or 10, but you'll have them in adjacent territories. And when they're singing at the same time, you can kind of start to figure out where one territory ends or where another begins, and figure out the boundaries. So to the best of my ability, I grouped the detections that I had into territories. Again, this would represent potentially a mated pair, and use that to arrive at a territory density. The hermit thrushes were typically using areas that were, again, this is one of my plots, and the red is the high severity, and then the yellow, green, and orange are lower severity, but most of the activity that we were observing was really in these lower severity areas. So we took the territories in each of these field sites, applied that across the total area of the park. Used 3 different methods to estimate that. Again, I won't go into all the details of that. But what we found that pre-fire, again, there was about 2,000 potential for about 2,000 territories pre-fire, but that after the fire, it was really probably closer to 1,000 territories. So from the 3 different methods we looked at, it was probably about a 48% to a 62% decline in the hermit thrush population. And so that was 1 year post-fire. And I did go back 2 years post-fire only for one trip. But I would say that, just anecdotally, I didn't analyze the data. I would say that probably the population of hermit thrushes was again cut in half in 2 years post-fire. So just quickly, I want to thank all the folks that helped so much with logistical support, and all these amazing field assistants I had, and folks helping with analysis. And especially want to thank California State Parks Foundation, who helped fund this research, and of course, California State Parks. So there's my email address if you want to contact me or have any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. Does anyone have any questions for Allison? We have time for maybe 1 question, maybe 2, and then we'll have to move on. Okay, so I guess my question, Allison, would be, when do you expect the population to recover, and how long would you think that might take? So
So there's been speculation that the habitat will, it may not be, similar to where it was in our lifetimes. And so just having been out there doing the field work, the areas that the hermit thrush were using are completely filled, neck high with these plants that were never there before, and are not part of the normal composition. Hermit thrushes have in the breeding ground, they have pretty specific habitat needs. They're along the coast, they are found in this very specific habitat. And so a lot of studies show that their numbers just decline sequentially over time post-fire, that initially they'll be concentrated in these low severity areas. And so, climate change models of changes in bird distribution have shown that hermit thrushes will, their distribution will move north and move, up in elevation with climate change. And so I really see this as likely a reduction in the range of the hermit thrush. It's hard to say if and when it will recover or come back to Big Basin. If they can adapt and use different habitat, then that would be fantastic. But since they do have such specific habitat needs, it's going to be a while before the habitat is back to where they to what they were used to and adapt and co-evolved with.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm going to combine into one, and then we'll have to move on. So one is asking if you could comment on the change in nesting behavior with the loss of habitat. And then the other is, what do you think the largest parameter is that is driving the decrease in population? Is it huckleberry loss and loss of a food source or something else?
So I would say that hang on, let me just stop my share here. I would say that the probably one of the biggest changes is that there's so little cover for the birds. And so, initially there was very little cover. And so there was a lot of probably issues with predation from jays or ravens. And it wasn't until pretty late in the season that there was redwoods resprouting, providing enough of a cover at the base of the trees for them to nest in. I did have some slides of some cool nests we did find, and they're being very creative actually, which was extremely cool. We found one nest in this clump there was a tan oak branch that had just a clump of dead leaves still attached to it, kind of creating this little hammock, and a hermit thrush had put a nest right in this hammock. It was easy enough to find because there wasn't a lot of cover coming to and from that branch, but it did have cover over it. And then there was a nest that some contractors found up. There was a redwood that had split up the middle, burned through the interior of the trunk. And there's sort of a little shelf, maybe 15 or 20 feet high up in the tree. And the hermit thrush had just put the nest right on this shelf in the interior of the trunk of the tree, which is really interesting. But they need, one of the things that they need is they will, and I watched them make this nest, they will peel the bark off of, like if you've ever taken your thumbnail and peeled the bark off of a redwood branch, it's got that kind of fine golden hair to it. They'll peel the bark off and collect these really, really fine redwood bark fibers, and they'll line the nest with that. So if what they're finding is a lot of, just dead charred branches, it's harder to acquire that material. So yeah, they'd have to get pretty creative.
Got it. Thanks. We're going to have to move forward now. Thank you so much, Allison.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
so
for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Our next speaker is going to be Kristy Doerr, and she is at San Jose State University. And she's a master's student studying mammal recovery in the fire. So I'm going to have her. Is she ready to go?
I am.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Kristy.
All right. Can you guys see that?
Yes, it looks great. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for coming tonight. My name is Kristy Doerr, and I'm an environmental studies master's student at San Jose State University. My research focuses on monitoring mammal recovery after the CZU fire and studying the role that burn severity plays in wildlife recolonization after a fire. My research is still in progress and I'm still collecting data, but I have some preliminary findings to share with you guys about the wildlife that I've seen so far. So as we all know, fire is an essential part of California's landscape, and it's shaped the plants and animals that live here. It can improve habitat by creating more foraging opportunities, producing structures to nest and hide, and it supports complex ecosystems. Many forests, like redwoods, historically experience frequent low severity fires, which native flora and fauna are well adapted to. However, fire suppression and climate change have led to a drastic increase in the size and intensity of fire in recent years. In 2020, California experienced record-breaking numbers of large fires, including the CZU Lightning Complex Fire. So what happens to wildlife during a fire? We know that wildlife have different strategies to survive a fire, and those are influenced by the fire behavior. Mobile species like mammals will flee and seek refuge in unburned areas, whereas smaller and slower species like amphibians will shelter in place, usually by burrowing. Animals are also known to seek refuge in water or on paved surfaces to avoid the flames. And these strategies are generally effective, but increased fire intensity and speed can hinder the escape for fleeing animals, and the soil can heat beyond the point of protection for burrowing wildlife. Unfortunately, Big Basin burned hot and fast and consumed the whole park in less than 24 hours, which does make it harder for wildlife to escape. It is difficult to evaluate the number of animals lost in a fire, though, but small animals like rodents can often be found to have perished in the fire. However, it is rare to find large animals. There were reports in Big Basin of groups of deceased squirrels that were found in parking lots attempting to shelter from the fire. So that lines up with what we would kind of expect. So what happens to wildlife after a fire? As wildlife habitat has already been drastically reduced by anthropogenic development and activity, fire poses a greater risk to wildlife as it can reduce the suitable habitat and the connectivity, which allows wildlife to move throughout the land. The main factors influencing the ability to recolonize are the food availability, habitat cover, and the land connectivity. After a fire, wildlife, they must adapt to the resources that have changed, and usually less resources, and they also face higher predation rates. But some animals will actually favor burned areas and other will avoid it, depending on their diet and their habitation or habitat requirements. For example, some herbivores like deer often take advantage of new plant growth in recently burned land, whereas ambush predators like bobcats and pumas will often avoid these areas due to the lack of cover to sneak up on prey. Overall, though, wildlife are incredibly resilient and they're pretty good at adapting to the changed environment after most fires. The severity of a fire, though, has major impacts on the ability for wildlife to adapt after the disturbance. Low severity fires can actually benefit the forest and wildlife by burning through the understory and reducing ladder fuels. This is critical because the accumulation of ladder fuels allow fires to climb into the canopies of trees and kill them. By leaving behind the surviving plants, though, the forest can continue to absorb carbon dioxide and provide cover for wildlife. High severity fires, on the other hand, often kill large numbers of trees and damage the soil, which can make it difficult for native plants to grow.
They also cause high levels of erosion, which can lead to runoff entering water sources and damaging aquatic habitat, as well as reducing vegetation and resources that disrupt wildlife corridors, especially for animals that rely on plant cover for protection. There are currently no studies that investigate the wildlife recovery in different burn severities of redwood forests. And so even though the CZU fire was very tragic, it does give us an opportunity to learn about this unique ecosystem and how its relationship with fire works. So for my study, I set out to evaluate the relationship between burn severity and wildlife recolonization. I chose 2 different state parks that were both affected by the CZU fire, but burned in completely different ways. Big Basin is my first site, and as you all know, it experienced extremely destructive high severity fire. And my second site is Butno State Park, which lies northeast of Big Basin, and it experienced mostly low severity fire. You can see Butno is circled up top and is mostly green, meaning low severity. And then Big Basin is down below and it's mostly red and yellow, meaning that it burned at a moderate and high severity. Because redwood forests have historically experienced frequent low severity burns that clear through the understory but leave the crowns of the trees intact, Butno is more similar to what the historic fire regime would be or what a prescribed burn would look like. For my study, I set up a total of 24 camera traps across both sites, and they were placed along a grid. I started monitoring about a year after the fire in fall 2021, and so they've been up for about a year now. But for this presentation, I excluded smaller mammals, and I focused on mammals that were larger than a rabbit, and that came out to a total of 9 species. For the preliminary data I have so far, there was a total of about 2,600 trap nights in Big Basin and about 2,900 in Butno. And so trap nights are just the number of nights that a camera was set up to monitor wildlife. And then to ensure independence, one capture was only counted every 30 minutes, so one individual could not make several detections. So to show a sample of what I've seen in the park so far, I made a graph of the relative abundance index that was found in each site. Because it's difficult to determine the absolute abundance of camera traps, relative abundance is often used. And this accounts for the number of detections and the number of nights a camera trap was set up, which tells you the detections per 100 trap nights for each species. So the good news is that of the species found, all were present in both Butno and Big Basin in the high and low severity. So that would indicate that mammals are returning to Big Basin and that the species richness is comparable in both sites. However, the abundance of these species are lower in Big Basin for every single one. So this tells us that overall wildlife do better in areas with lower severity fire, such as what happened in Butno, whereas high severity fire reduces habitat quality and may take longer to recolonize. Because it's difficult to see the differences between the parks for the less common species on the vertical bar graph, this graph shows the same thing, but it shows the percent of species detections per park. And so if the rate of detection was the same in each park, the green and red would meet right in the middle at 50%. So you can see the largest differences were found in bobcats and pumas, who are both ambush predators. And this kind of makes sense because they like the dense vegetation to hunt, and so it's not surprising that they would avoid these open areas from the high severity fire. And then the third biggest difference was in possums, who might be avoiding Big Basin because of the lack of cover as well and less trees to climb in and whatnot. And then so the species that appeared to show less of a preference between the low and high severity areas were both skunks, raccoons, gray foxes, and black-tailed deer. So although these are only preliminary findings, there are some clear trends that can help inform state parks as they work to restore the land and conserve wildlife. For example, it appears that the ambush predators avoid using the severely burned areas, so enhancing habitat for these species and their prey by increasing cover could be helpful. It's also clear that the low severity burned areas, similar to that of a prescribed burn, are preferred by wildlife over high severity areas and may improve habitat. My hope is that these findings will help aid in future wildlife conservation efforts and can be used by land managers in the Santa Cruz Mountains to encourage prescribed burns, which will help prevent these destructive high severity fires in the future. Thank you guys for listening. I have listed my contact information here if anybody would like that, and I can take your questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Kristy. Does anyone have any questions for Kristy? We have time for maybe one question. We're running a little bit long. So here's a question. What do you expect for wildfire recovery as climate change intensifies and causes more intense fires? Or what do you expect for wildlife recovery? Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, wildlife are pretty good at recovering from fires, but as we've seen the last couple of years, this is happening at a much more accelerated rate than it has in the past. And I think that if this keeps happening, even if they recover well the first time, maybe they won't the second time. And, populations can remain in flux for decades after fires. So if these keep getting stacked on top of one another, I think they're going to start to have a lot harder of a time. And that, in addition to other pressures like habitat fragmentation, I think that they will struggle.
Yeah. Anyone else? And check quickly. Okay, so I think, thank you so much, Christine. I'm sure people will contact you via email if they have questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll have to move on now finally to our last speaker, Jerry Smith. He's a professor emeritus at San Jose State University. Oh no, he was here. Oh, I see him. So he should be able to unmute his phone now. Jerry, hello.
I'm here.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Oh, yeah, and I'm sharing your slides. Give me 1 second. I forgot about that. And let me share my screen. Share screen. Okay, so Jerry, take it away.
Next slide, please.
Mhm.
Okay. Back in 1992, in response to the need to get data for salmon and steelhead listing, I started sampling on Waddell Creek, Gazos Creek, and Scott Creeks on the coast. This is Waddell Creek. The upper part would be Slippery Falls, the upper limit of steelhead and salmon accessibility. And this is a picture, Google Earth, right after the fire. And you can see that severe burn, leaving downed and standing dead trees throughout much of the watershed. But if you look at the lower part, Stevens Camp, which is 2.6 miles upstream from the coast, the riparian habitat was still intact. And so as you go up the system, the fire had greater and greater effects, burning to the edge of the stream and across the stream. And so I'm going to take you on a quick field trip through Waddell Creek, and if I have time, Gazos Creek. to deal with the stream habitat conditions as a result of the fire. One comment, we've got the East Fork and the West Fork, and then below that, the confluence of the two further downstream. Most of the watershed, excuse me, is in Santa Cruz mudstone, a very lightweight, fragile rock that has some major implications. But Butano sandstone, kind of a hard sandstone, is on the East Fork. And the western slope of the main stem and the West Fork is much steeper and drier. Next slide, please. After the fire, there were people that said, boy, I hope we get heavy rain so that the vegetation comes back. And what actually happened was that first winter, there was very little rain. Pescadero is the nearest gauging station, but it's outside the fire zone, basically. So there was little rain the first winter, no ground cover developed until 2022, but there was very little erosion for most of the stream during that first summer, 2021. The stream flow after the fire was greatly enhanced because there weren't trees taking the water. And so the stream flow actually went up. So although it was a drought year, the stream flow was better than you would expect for a drought condition. The second year, in October and in December of 2021, there were major storms. And the extent of those storms was substantially greater than shown in the graph, because without the vegetation in place, you had substantially more runoff. So you had major rain and floods at a time when there was no ground cover to protect the soils. And so you had severe widespread erosion and stream deposition and so on, and channel wood moving. And this happened in Waddell Creek, to a lesser extent in Gazos Creek, but it also happened in Scott Creek, which I won't be talking about. Next slide, please. So upstream to about mile 275, the fire burned down to the riparian zone, and that's where it stopped. So you had a few trees that might have fallen in, damage from the fire, but alders got hot enough that they actually cooked up at the upper end of that mile 275. So that was the first year. No real damage down there. Second year, you had the major storms, and the west slope of the main stem and the upper West Fork eroded like crazy, and wood moved. There's a major new log jam that, as tight as can be, 10 feet high, no space in it, extends across the entire floodplain. So this is the accumulation of wood that moved down, and that is a major barrier to fish movement. The pools in the downstream area that weren't affected by the fire directly filled in during that second year. Wood moved and silt moved, and you actually filled in. So the picture in the lower right used to be a long pool with depths to 3 feet, and now the local scour is around a single log, and most of the deep habitat is gone. And the deep habitat for salmon and steelhead is most important for getting them through the winter and the storm periods of winter. Next slide, please. From mile 2.8 up to the forks, the west slope eroded substantially in the second year, but also in the first year. In the upper right picture, this is near the forks, 3 miles upstream on Waddell Creek. There's a ridgetop to stream debris flow. And between mile 2.8 and the forks, there were other steep slopes on the west slope that eroded substantially. And what it was the Santa Cruz mudstone erodes easily, and when the fire burned across it, the rock actually kind of exploded and produced tons and tons of half-inch kitty litter that filled the pools down to mile 2.8. So if you see in the lower left, that's what it looked like, these fine gravels. Next slide, please. So from 2.8 up to 3.7, as far as I went, there was a big difference between the steep left slope, the west slope, and all the way along, you lost many of the trees, and it's still bare soil right now from 2.85 up to 3.6. The east slope is a more gradual slope, and the trees are standing, the redwoods are sprouting, and epicormic sprouts. The tan oaks are sprouting, and things are in fairly good shape, and the ground cover was established by this summer. Next slide, please. On the West Fork, things got progressively worse. You lost the canopy in the first year along the stream, and it actually, in the upper right, it burned up a major log jam that was a fish barrier from 1998 off and on to the present. But the biggest problem for the habitat is in 2022, the steep west slope eroded like crazy and filled all of the pools on the west slope or on the West Fork. So the two lower right pictures, those are pools that were 3 or 4 feet deep. Now they're about 6 inches to a foot deep. Not much in the way of habitat for coho, which are pool fish, to use in the summer or to get fish over the winter. Next slide, please. The East Fork is a completely different situation. The East Fork lost the alders, alders were lost throughout the West Fork and the East Fork, and even below the confluence. Lost the alders and some of the streamside canopy, but the stream channel maintained itself. The bed of the stream is made up of Butano sandstone, which is cobbles and boulders, and that armors the bed, and so it doesn't scour out and doesn't fill in. The gravels just kind of skate down through the East Fork, and the East Fork now is the best habitat. Although historically, since 1999, the East Fork has suffered kills of fish from toxic materials, apparently coming from private property up on the East Fork. And you kind of hope that the meth labs or whatever got burned out in the fire, but it turns out that meth labs are apparently very resilient. And so the fish abundance in Waddell Creek this year was very, very low, and that could be a possible situation of toxic materials, and it could be a problem with the major log jam on the lower part of the river. Next slide, please.
Jerry, I think we should stop and ask a couple questions, and then I think we'll need to call it a day. Do you have a
Okay.
conclusion slide?
Yeah, if you go to the last slide, please.
Okay. Is this it?
Okay, on Gazos Creek, the fire didn't affect the riparian area as much, but you had the filling of pools. The other thing that happened on Gazos Creek is a lot of wood went into the channel. It aggregated into 6 major log jams that are potential fish barriers. So from a long-term concern about recovery, the upstream part of both watersheds and the west slope of Waddell, which is steep and has no ground cover right now, is a concern that will continue to bleed sediment. The log jams are a potential problem for fish passage for the endangered coho and threatened steelhead in the system, specifically 2 jams on the lower part of the watersheds in very narrow sections of the stream, and the log jams get there and tend to stay, so you had to modify them. Now, in 82 and 83, those storms took out riparian habitat and filled pools in Waddell Creek. And 10 to 15 years later, if you get the right kinds of storms, not severe storms, you actually got the alders coming back, and you got flushing of much of the sediment. And you don't, so in the mix of what happens in the future, you don't want more sediment going in. You don't want years like 82, 83, or 98 to put more sediment in. And there will be, short term, 10 to 15 years, you should get some substantial recovery.
Great.
And if there's
Thank
time
you.
for questions, I'll take them.
Okay, so that was the question. The question was about, do you expect the pools that are filled with sediment to be washed out and the pools to return? And so you're saying in 10 to 15 years or after some major flood events, you expect that to occur?
What you need is moderately wet years, not the big floods, the El Nino floods like 83 and 98, or the January storm of 82. So it's a matter of what your mix of runoff is.
Okay, great, thank you. So with that, we're going to have to end the symposium. It's a little bit after 8. I apologize for going over on time. I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Jerry, and all the speakers, without whom none of this would be possible. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. I want to note that there's a recording of this that'll be on YouTube. And if you don't have the link can be found on the Santa Cruz Mountain Bioregional Council website. Jerry will be writing an update to some of his work on the website itself. And if we plan to try and do one of these again in the coming years, because as everyone has mentioned, this is a dynamic system. And so as we come up with another program, we will be sure to let you know, and we will put that on the website. The website again is SCMBC.org, Santa Cruz Mountains Bioregional Council. So thank you all for attending, and we hope you all have a great evening. And we will do this again. Feel free to contact me or any of the speakers and visit our website and watch it on YouTube. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Zane.
Bye, thank you.